people who believe that the programs of the right and the left make them diametrical opposites, inherent enemies that goes on forever. There are others who seem to feel that there's some possibility for communication between the right and the left, people like us and the militia movements and so on. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It depends a lot what you mean by the right and the left. So, for example, the Cato Institute is right.
I don't mean that.
Okay, but look, I mean, for years, until before Z was founded, in fact, the only journal in the country that I could write for was the Journal of the Cato Institute, because we agreed on a lot of things. I mean, we disagreed fundamentally on basic things, but on, say, state terrorism, a lot of things in international affairs, intervention, so on and so forth, we agreed. So it was pretty open, so I could write things there. Well, that's right, left. If you look at the militia movements, I think they're a pretty complicated phenomenon. Like, take somebody like Timothy McVeigh. You take a look at his background. You know, I mean, he's a guy who fought in the Gulf War. And who knows what experiences he went through. It wasn't very pretty, I'm sure. He's somebody whose life has the community that he comes from, the sector of the population that he comes from, their lives have completely fallen apart. I mean, in the last 20 years, their incomes have declined sharply. Their wives have to go out and work to put food on the table, which they don't like from the culture they come from. And nobody would like, if people want to work, fine, but they're forced to work, just to survive. The kids don't pay attention to him. There's the whole world of the way he perceived it is falling apart. So, you lash out. You lash out at he didn't blow up a corporate headquarters, notice. You blow up a federal building because you had it drilled into your head that the enemy is the government, not because of the bad things the government does, but because of the good things it does. Namely, it supports, it has some function. Part of its function is to serve the public interest. That's why it's attacked so much. But that's all he hears. Federal government is the bad guys, so let's go blow them up. Well, that's kind of, you have to understand that. It's not coming out of nowhere. These are parts of the population that back in the 1930s would have been organizing the CIO. Well, that option isn't open at the moment, so go to other ones. I think there's, in fact, if you go back to the union organizing days, it was bringing in sectors of the population that were very destructive before. If if alternative options are open, same sectors can become very constructive. Is that a bridge between the left and the right? Well, if you make it, I mean, I don't know Timothy McVeigh, but I think people like that could be made to understand that their enemy is not the federal government. Their enemy is private power, and the federal government, insofar as it's run by private power, which is most of it. There's been a kind of interesting shift in just mass entertainment in this respect over the years. So I've been told, maybe you know better than me, but you go back to the 1950s and say television, the FBI was just, gods. Now I think the FBI is, if you look at a standard cop show, the FBI is the bad guys. It's the local police who are the good guys, and the FBI is coming in and screwing everything up, and they got to get them out of their hair and so on and so forth. I understand that that's been quite a considerable shift. And if you think about the way the FBI was glorified back in the 50s, it's a pretty remarkable shift. Well, I suspect that that's part of the general propaganda of trying to make people hate the federal government, but support the parts of the federal government that protect them from all kind of enemies and in fact funnel money to rich people. It's kind of nuanced, but I think that's happening, and you see that in the militia movement. Let's attack the federal government as the enemy because not private power, and of course let's keep the Pentagon, And they don't know that the NIH and the NSF are doing the same thing.
Yeah, I want to ask how these propaganda things work. For example, we've watched wages go down, 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 down over a couple of decades, yet nobody thinks they're underpaid, they are overtaxed. And, this is obviously a propaganda ploy, but who and how does this sort of thing, I mean, all of a sudden there's this big full-blown tax revolt that has, where did it come from and how?
You know, look, I mean, you live here just as much as I do. Everything that reaches people is you're overtaxed, you're giving the money away to these pointy-headed bureaucrats and these welfare mothers and these third world countries and so on, and you're suffering because you're paying too much taxes. That's all anybody hears. Well, you know, it's very hard when you're sitting alone and you hear nothing but this flood of stuff to say, wait a minute, you know, maybe I'm not over, maybe we're undertaxed. See, it's interesting, if you ask people, you look at polls, the same people who say that they're overtaxed say they would like to have more money spent on education, on mass transportation, on preservation of the environment, actually even on welfare. If you don't call it welfare, because welfare has been demonized, but if you take a look at a poll where they say, should we guarantee health and you know, sufficient food and decent living conditions for everybody? Yeah, most people say yes. If you call the same thing welfare, they say no. If you ask people to estimate how much of the federal budget goes to welfare, they give estimates which are kind of, you know, like off the map, way beyond anything that it is, like a third of the federal budget or something. That's a standard estimate. If you ask people how much money should go, they give estimates that are higher than the amount that does go. Same with foreign aid. You ask people how much money should the United States spend in foreign aid, they give the standard answer is way higher than it is. If you ask people how much money do we give for foreign aid, they think it's way too high and ought to be cut back. Well, you know, that's not that people are bad. You know, that's what they hear. What they hear is we're giving all our money away to these, you know, third world people who are living in luxury, and I'm working hard. Why should I give my money to them? On the other hand, if you say, well, should we give this amount of aid abroad? They say, yeah, sure, a lot more, in fact. So where does the propaganda come from? Well, you know, you see it every time you turn on the tube, and every time you read the newspaper, and every time you read the journals of opinion, and so on. It's constant. I mean, the United States is, in fact, undertaxed. If you look at the actual facts, which are available, they're not hard to find, the poverty level here is, the United States has the worst record among the industrial countries, bar none, in things like child poverty, hunger, you know, inequality, and so on. Just about every measure, it's the worst. If you want the latest figures, UNESCO, which still barely exists, just came out with its 1997 report. It was just data, you know, just data on things like child poverty and mortality and so on for the countries of the world. It's just alphabetical. But if you look at the industrial countries, the United States is flat out the worst. Okay. Now, where does that come from? Okay. Well, if you look at actual income, the United States is not the worst. So if you take, say, if you look at the distribution of income from, say, wages, the United States is more or less like other countries. So how does it get to be the worst in child poverty and inequality? Well, because it's the worst in transfer payments. So, for example, in France or Sweden or whatever, the government intervention, which means the public intervention to provide people's needs, has a kind of progressive character. Okay, so it shifts funding to some extent from the rich to the poor. In the United States, it doesn't. So if you look before transfer payments, the U.S. isn't off the, you know, redistribution, whatever government redistribution there is, like welfare and stuff like that. If you look before that, the United States is sort of the norm. If you look after it, it's the worst. Well, that's because we're undertaxed. And not only undertaxed, but regressively taxed. I mean, every country is, but the U.S. is worse. And that disparity shows it quite strikingly. It's that component of the system, the transfer payments, in which the United States is by far the worst. End result is we've got hunger, child poverty, you know, starvation among the elderly, you know, all these things that other countries don't. And it's because we're undertaxed. But, you know, how many people know this? I mean, how many people read the, you know, biennial report, State of Working America, which has all this data? Like, you know, people we know, that's who reads it.
Somebody's supposed to be reading that and then getting...
Well, I'm reading it. You can read it, you know. But it's not going to go to the mass of the population. Okay, because in order to get to the general population, see, look, I can read it because I'm a university professor, right? I got free time, I have resources, I've got money, you know, I have all these things that make it possible to do it. Suppose you and suppose you have a couple who are working each 50 hours a week to put food on the table. They're not going to read this book. They don't even know it exists. You know, they couldn't even know that this data exists. They wouldn't know how to find it if somebody told them it did exist. I mean, they're not part of that tiny privileged sector of the population which can do these things. Well, okay, that's what radical organizations are for, to make it available to the general population. I mean, that's what a labor movement is for. A big part of the labor movement was always worker education. Like when I was a kid, my family was mostly first-generation immigrants who were working class. They knew all these things. A lot of them never went to school, you know, but they knew all of these things. In fact, knew them very well, you know, better than the people in universities. Yeah, they were part of a lively, organized labor movement and political movement. Actually, the political movement was often the Communist Party back in those days. But whatever you think about it, it was a political, I didn't like it, you know, but it was a political movement that brought people in and gave them a way to participate. Well, okay, the labor movement, the political movements, and so on, they can make these things available.
But so much of it is misinformation. Is somebody sitting out in a think tank saying, this week we'll demonize working mothers, and this weekend we'll attack daycare, and I will talk about divorce some more and say how awful that is, and the morals, you know, all this stuff. Why is the misinformation?
Why is it there?
I guess
because the misinformation is very much in the interests of people with privilege and power.
Okay.
So, and since they have the privilege and power and resources, why shouldn't they put it out? I mean, what do you expect them to do? Tell the truth? Why should they?
First of all, objectivity is dead and truth is dead, and that's the objective truth.
Right. Yeah.
Do you ever think that maybe just the fact that Noam Chomsky is allowed to run around and talk and that maybe that is proof of the power of these propaganda machines, that, or the whole system, that it can allow someone who's saying your version of the truth to exist as they're still doing their own thing?
Well, what would be the alternative?
We'll be winning when you're shot.
Yeah, I don't understand exactly what. I mean, like, who would see? Remember, this is more or less. I mean, it's not a capitalist society. A capitalist society couldn't survive for 3 minutes. But if you look at the spectrum of world societies, this is toward the capitalist end. Okay. Now, in a real capitalist society, everything is a commodity. You know, everything's available. You get as much as you can buy. Okay. And that's also true of freedom. And if you think about the United States, it's very free. I mean, the amount of freedom is very large compared with other societies. And you get as much as you can buy. Well, I can buy a lot. Okay. Furthermore, other people from my same class background would not want the state to have the power to act against me. So if the state were to act against me, I would get supported by rich, powerful people because they don't want the state to have the power to act against people like them, namely me. Okay? Well, for ugly reasons, you get a lot of freedom. And actually, this covers quite a large part of the society. On the other hand, if you're a black organizer in the ghetto, you can get murdered because nobody cares whether the state has the power to go after them, you know. And they don't have the resources to buy a lot of freedom. I mean, it's a very unequal class society, and I suspect all of us, certainly me, benefit from that in the sense that we can buy a lot of privilege. That's why we're here, you know. How many people have the opportunity to spend some time in a place like this? You know, you got to be part of a fairly privileged sector even to be part of it. Okay, and this is a rich country, super rich country by world